Good evening and welcome to this British Academy lecture. And welcome, I should say, to the new normal of hybrid media events, which this is a first, I think, for the British Academy. My name is Sonia Livingstone. I'm a professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science and a member of the Culture, Media and Performance section of the British Academy. And the British Academy, as you just saw, is the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and the Social Sciences. We mobilise these disciplines to understand the world and shape a brighter future. And we do this by investing in researchers and projects across the UK and overseas, engaging the public with fresh thinking and debates, and bringing together scholars, government, business and civil society to influence policy for the benefit of everyone. Tonight's event forms part of the British Academy lecture series and also the Geography Triennial lecture. The British Academy lecture series was established in 1908 and continues to be our flagship lecture programme today, showcasing the very best scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. Due to a COVID-induced hiatus, this is our first lecture for some time, and we are thrilled to welcome Professor Gillian Rose to the Academy this evening to relaunch the series. Gillian Rose is Professor of Human Geography at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of the British Academy and of the Academy of Social Sciences. She's the author of Feminism and Geography, Doing Family Photography, and Visual Methodologies, now in its 4th edition, as well as many papers on images, visualising technologies, and ways of seeing in urban, domestic, and archival spaces. Gillian's lecture is entitled Seeing the City Digitally, From Picturing Urban Spaces to Animating Urban Life. Following her talk, we'll open to audience questions, and we'll ask those in the room and those watching online to participate. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Gillian. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a real honour to have been invited to deliver this British Academy lecture. I'd like to thank my fellow geographers for the invitation, the British Academy for organising this event, and also to Sonia for chairing. So the past decade has seen a huge amount of scholarly work on the digital, the urban and everyday life, as well as what used to be called digital media. There are now substantial literatures on urban digital infrastructure, on big data, on social media, on platforms and platform capitalism, on platform urbanism, on surveillance capitalism, and our understandings of the interventions that are being made with and by digital things in very many spheres of life is growing hugely. And for many scholars, the dynamics of the contemporary world are indeed fundamentally shifting as digital data is extracted, processed and returned in different formats, devices and situations. And it's often suggested that cities are the sites where all this is happening most intensely. Scott McQuire describes this extension of network digital data throughout urban space as one of the key features distinguishing 21st century urban experience from earlier modes of urban inhabitation. Software-enabled technologies work with urban digital data of many kinds in a huge array of infrastructures and organisations. Many kinds of digital sensors generate data about cities, which is gathered, aggregated and analysed by various human and algorithmic agents, with consequences for things as diverse as the allocation of housing and healthcare, traffic management, policing, and the provision of utilities. While, of course, smartphones and their cameras and apps mediate more and more of everyday urban life, from socialising to travelling to eating. So everyday life, everyday urban life in very many places then is being shaped by what Sarah Barnes has called the intimate entanglements between people and digital data, which take place in large part through smartphones, but by no means only those. Many social science disciplines are contributing to understanding the implications of this data, of the data extracted from those entanglements. of the sorting and reaggregation of that data, and of the micro-targeting that allows, on the one hand, and our engagements and acts of sharing on the other. And analyses focus both on the technical design affordances of those technologies as well as how they're used. An approach which is often described in very broad terms as techno-social, and that's going to be my approach this evening as well. Now, this is an incredibly rich and lively body of work, and I can only draw on just a very few small parts of it this evening. And I'm really going to ask just one question to draw some themes together from it, which is, how is the sense of everyday urban space being visually mediated by digital technologies, specifically by all those images circulating on social media platforms? Now, social media is saturated with images. Most of the largest social media platforms, YouTube, Instagram, Pinterest, and now the new kid on the block, TikTok, were designed primarily to share images. And of course, Facebook, still the largest platform by some distance. Facebook is also image heavy. Every messaging app that we use, from Messenger to Snapchat to WhatsApp to good old texting, lets you send images, from emojis to videos. Images are ubiquitous in this digital everyday, to cite the title of a book by Martin Hand. And more recently, UC Perica and Thomas Dvořák's edited collection on what they call mass photography is called Photography Off the Scale, in reference to just these mind-boggling numbers. And of course, it's easy to be boggled by these numbers, and I'm sure you've all seen other versions of these particular statistics. But it's important, of course, to think not just about how many images there are in this digital everyday, but also to think about what processes are creating those numbers, the significance of those processes. And that's what Hand and Perica and Dvořák and many other scholars are arguing now. So what I want to propose this evening is that given those processes, which are both technological and social, digital images are in fact not best thought of as images anymore, or perhaps not only as images, or maybe not as images in the way that we have generally tended to think about images to now. Digital images, I think, are most productively approached as data, first and foremost, as data that's processed by software. And that has significant theoretical implications. It has methodological implications for researchers. That might be something we want to touch on in discussion afterwards. And also, the main theme of this lecture is making a big difference to everyday urban visual cultures. Now, in 2001, Sage published what turned out to be just the first edition of a book that I've written on visual methodologies. In fact, I'm just producing the fifth edition, which I'm not really sure is what the world needs, but that's where I find myself. Visual Methodologies is a sort of manual on how to do research with images. And in 2001, for that first edition, it was clear that most academic approaches, at least, to working with images treated them as representations. So representational ways of seeing assume that there is a real of some kind, that images, no matter how selectively or distortingly, represent that real to the viewer in some way. Now, of course, there's been quite a lot of rethinking of that approach in the intervening years, partly driven by different theoretical agendas, but also as more and more images have gone online, have gone digital, and as different things have started to be done with images. And I've done my own rethinking through a number of research projects looking at how cities are visualized, particular cities, particular case studies. Plus a lot of what I'd like to call rather grandly autoethnography, but actually has been pretty intense in the last year. Has involved a lot of watching popular movies on Netflix, a lot of browsing Twitter, few home renovation projects using Pinterest, following my kids on Instagram, peering over my daughter's shoulder as she shows me vines that have been archived on YouTube and TikToks, which she finds fascinating and completely baffle me. So what I want to do this evening is to pull a few threads of that work together to suggest that enough is changing in our contemporary visual culture to demand a rethink about how we conceptualize images and our ways of experiencing them. Now, in a relatively short lecture, I can only really gesture towards that argument, and I'm certainly going to be drawing on the work of a lot of other scholars. I know what I'm not going to be able to do is to sufficiently problematize the city and our experience that I've already mentioned. It's rather peppered my introduction. I want to acknowledge that this talk has been written from the city in which I live and work in the UK. the cities that I've researched and the cities that I connect with in various ways through various media channels. So I know there's going to be all sorts of specificities and omissions that will generate, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session where I hope we can explore some of them. So my talk has 4 parts. I'm going to begin with a few brief comments on the visual representation of urban space. I then want to say a bit more about what it means to think about images as data. I then want to propose that everyday social media images don't so much represent or picture the urban as make us feel it in particular ways, and I describe that as a kind of visual animation of the city. And I then want to say something about difference and power. And in particular, I want to do that by thinking about how bodies, our corporeal embodiments, are caught up in all of this. I think we're very used to hearing arguments about how data is extracted from everyday online interactions, how our bodies are abstracted into digital data, how that data becomes a kind of commodity, platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism. But I'd like to point to other forms of power which are also at work, particularly through the visual digital mediation of urban spaces. So let me begin then with saying something about the visual representation of urban space. Now, there's an argument that by the end of the 19th century, in Europe for sure, in its settler colonies and its empires, culture, visual culture, was thoroughly urban. Cities were the sites of all sorts of innovations in visual technologies, from balloon flights, panoramas, electric billboards, films, dioramas, photography, gaslighting. City dwellers bought new visual objects like daguerreotypes, postcards, tourist guides, carte de visite, and they encountered new visual experiences in cinemas, arcades, expositions, and department stores. Cities themselves were pictured intensively in fine art, in film, architecture, art photography, also, of course, the maps and diagrams of planners, as well as documentary photography, photojournalism, tourist snaps, computer, games, comics, music video, the list goes on and on. And we know that picturing matters. It frames and interprets the urban in important and productive ways. And that framing has been understood as a representation of city spaces. Pictures of cities were generally understood to show a version of an actually existing, real urban environment. And those representations were always taken to be selective, interpretative in some way, but nonetheless, they assumed an actual city that existed apart from those representations. And scholarship on this broadly suggests that the importance of photography and particular kinds of cartography to the management and the planning of those cities as they grew and emerged in the later 19th century was particularly central to this representationalism. So by the 1880s, there was a widespread assumption in the West that the city must be made visible in order to be understood and managed and planned. It had to be legible and inspectable, to use Chris Otter's term. John Tagg has explored the enrolment of photography into this project. Photography invented and then kind of understood, interpreted as a technology of generating apparently reliable evidence about urban housing, for example. And photographic technologies were used extensively as evidence in projects of urban planning and reform. Planners and social campaigners and proto-social scientists photographed, as well as mapping and filming and diagramming, both what needed improving, as well as their ideal models for houses, neighbourhoods and cities. And according to Christine Boyer, this visualising work asserted an absolute correspondence between the exterior city reality and its truthful and purified representation. So projects to modernise cities then took images of cities as imprints or traces of actual urban spaces. Now this notion of the image as a trace or a representation of a real became a sort of default of much of Western visual culture, I think we might say, albeit, I completely acknowledge this, all sorts of counter traditions and exceptions, and I'm sure many of you are already thinking of some of them. It was particularly central, though, for example, to the role that photography played in colonial and imperial projects, for sure. And the importance of the camera to this generated a kind of photorealism, what Stephen Prince calls camera reality, which is still massively influential. So even in the most recent, the most spectacular of the recent slew of Marvel movies, where monsters crash into the streets of London and New York, or invaded by zombies, the cityscape is still represented through Western conventions of perspective. And huge efforts are put into getting the light looking right. the alien hordes looking real. Even the visual imperfections of analog film are painstakingly inserted back into digital images in order for the digital fantasy to look real, as we have come to see the real through over a century of analog filmmaking and photography driven by camera technologies. But these films are digital. What they show us is impossible with analog technologies. Digital images are a fundamentally different kind of object, even if they can be made to look similar to the kinds of photographs and films and maps and so on that we're used to. So what is that difference? What's the digitality of digital images? Well, the digital image itself is data. And there's a very long quote there on the screen, which I'm going to unpack in the next minutes or so. It's from a book by Ingrid Herzl and Remy Marie called The Soft Image, and I think it's a really interesting account that summarizes a lot of the implications of this digitality. So let's go through that quote. To begin with, I want to pull out the fact that they talk about the way that the digital images are ubiquitous. And I've already said that that's a kind of classic characteristic that many scholars have pointed to in relation to digital imagery. But perhaps most fundamentally, what Herzl and Marie emphasize is that the digital image that we see, my PowerPoint, your Zoom screen, is a result of the continuous processing of data. The screen is always being updated in real time. Smartphone cameras do extensive processing of the data harvested by their light sensors to produce the photograph's image file. And the film critic Thomas Alsacer has described how digital images emerge from data that's harvested and then manipulated by combinations of hardware and software. And he suggests that this shifts digital images away from notions of representational capture, in which the image is seen as a trace or an imprint of the world, into something more akin to an ongoing process of extraction from and sculpting of the world. So rather than a representational trace, he's suggesting that digital images are more like an ongoing event, and Scott McQuire talks about this as well. So digital images are also infinitely adaptable because they're continually worked on by software, whether as they're being created, or by elaborate desktop photo editing software packages, or by the filters on your Instagram phone app. The images are constantly shifting. And new forms of imagery emerge, GIFs, memes, an obvious example, but also conventional genres of images are increasingly muddled and mixed and matched, overlaid and patched together. And digital images can be displayed on many different screens. They are multi-platform. The same image file can be materialized in many different forms and in different locations, which may well invite different ways of seeing it. So it can be printed out on paper, for example, and appear on a magazine or a billboard. But it might also appear on a website homepage, or on a desktop, or on a smartphone. And Francesco Cassetti has a really interesting book talking about some of the implications of that for cinema and how we now see films, that distributed multi-platform aspect of digital images. And of course, digital images are designed to be shared, to move across different screens. They are always potentially networked. They're ready to be shared via the internet on social media platforms, among others. An image file's metadata label and format an image file so that it's platform ready, to quote Adrian Mackenzie and Anna Munster, ready for posting, but also for being searchable and for being processed by other software, often for ends actually entirely other than social networking. And this is the synchronic data-to-data relationships that Herzl and Marie describe. So that platformatization is central to what social media images are. And finally, they are shared, of course. Taking photos with camera phones and sharing them on social media platforms is a hugely popular social practice. And without that popularity, none of the technical affordances that Herzl and Marie list here would matter very much. And it's both those aspects of digital images, both the technological and the social, that explain why there are those unimaginably vast numbers of them. Now, for some commentators, this shift in the materiality of images, their specifically digital qualities, has brought about a kind of crisis in urban visibility. And there are actually some quite interesting echoes here of a similar crisis being experienced at the end of the late 19th century. That desire for the city to be inspectable was clearly never going to be fulfilled, and there's sort of worries about the dark slums and so on that could never be fully brought into the light. We have a kind of parallel concern emerging at the end of the 20th century. For example, in an earlier commentary by Christine Boyer in 1996 in her book Cyber Cities, she suggested that this crisis of seeing the digital city was because of what she considered to be the immateriality, the incoherence, and the extensivity of digital networks. The whole has gone to pieces, she said, and no longer has imageable form. There's no single viewpoint possible anymore. There's no observer looking at those hard images. Of course, we could question whether as I say, there ever was. Sarah Barnes has a slightly different take on this, certainly one that doesn't suggest digital images are immaterial in any way. Barnes talks about the opacity of what platforms are doing with images to users as the cause of what she thinks is the limit of visibility in the digitally mediated city. So we don't know what platforms are doing with all the sort of stuff we upload to them. There's a kind of black box back end that's intervening in our visual imaging of the city, but we don't really know completely sort of how that's happening. Now, in their discussion of images on social media platforms, Mackenzie and Munster agree that cities can no longer be represented by digital imagery. And this quote, they're referring to that mass of online images, and they say that these contemporary image ensembles aren't simply quantitatively beyond our imagining, but qualitatively not of the order of representation. Their operativity, they say, can't be seen by an observing subject, but rather is enacted via observation events distributed throughout and across devices, hardware, human agents, and artificial networked architectures. So what Mackenzie and Munster are pointing to here in this quote is that less the processuality of images, that constant reworking through software, although that is important in their wider discussion, but the consequence of the network distribution of ubiquitous imagery. And what they're suggesting is not that that's made the city impossible to visualize, but actually it's changed how the city is visualized. It makes visuality itself as distributed, as mediated by hardware, software, and humans, and it produces what they call platform seeing. Now, I agree with them. I think imagery still does matter profoundly to urban space, but it's now often a different kind of imagery which is seen and experienced differently, with different consequences for the visual mediation of urban knowledge and experience. And I think it's important to note here that, as well as the technological changes that have tracked through this shift, if shift there is, the broader kind of institutional and social context here has shifted away from projects of urban planning and management and towards the platform urbanisms created by those ubiquitous everyday interactions with social media platforms. And there's a kind of commercial imperative there that did not exist 30, 40 years ago. So if pictures that represent cities are no longer where it's at, or at least no longer only where it's at, what sort of images then? What sort of ways of seeing are there? So I want to suggest that we need to think less about pictures of the urban that represent cities and more about how digital imaging makes us feel the urban in particular ways. And I started to think about this with Claire Mail-Hewish and Monica Deegan a decade or so ago now on a project that looked at an example of an urban redevelopment project in Doha, Qatar, which was using computer-generated images to visualize what that development would look like when it's completed. And of course, these kinds of images are part of the ubiquity of digital images in city spaces now. You see them on billboards everywhere. Now, at one level, we can certainly continue to see these kind of images as representations that are being used, in this case, to sell houses, apartments, and retail space. I'm not, therefore, suggesting that representation is no longer a valid way of looking at what some images are doing in the world. These are clearly selective images that choose to show only very particular kinds of urban futures, sunny and clean and full of happy people doing relaxed kinds of things. Other scholars have looked at other aspects of digital images and remarked again on their selective representation of city spaces. And here's a slightly overexposed image from a paper by John Boy and Eustace Utermark at mapping which parts of Amsterdam appear most often on Instagram. And they talk about how, as is typical on Instagram, the content of the images is highly selective, it's only hip and cool places and things and events that get pictured, but also that particular places in the city get pictured more often than others. And in their paper, they argue that this representation, these selective images, have material consequences for the property market in the city because it's those neighbourhoods that are most visible on Instagram, which are also those neighbourhoods that are gentrifying most rapidly in the city. So there's a kind of mutual relationship going on there between the visualisation and the property market. But what also matters to those digital images of city spaces is the mood that they evoke. And as Monica Deegan has argued extensively in her work, urban redevelopment projects now depend heavily on their sense of place, their feel, their aesthetic. And in the case of the images made for the Doha project, in a book that Monica and I have co-authored, it's forthcoming early next year, we describe the particular feel of these images as glamorous. Now, glamour has been understood as a particular kind of sensory atmosphere which extends from things and captivates in particular ways. Glamour shows in luminous appearances that offer immersion without friction or effort in a gorgeous world without troubles. Glamour is about luscious visual surfaces, about colour and light and texture. It stages something desirable and apparently real, so there's this kind of legacy there of a certain kind of realism. So the viewer is caught up with the image and what it offers. And in our book, Monica and I elaborate this sense that these images draw you in sensorially through the work of Gernot Böhmer, who argues that atmospheres are sensory attributes that proceed from and co-constitute things, persons, and relations. Atmospheres are therefore spatial. They extend and envelop. And here's a quote from Böhmer talking about how the aesthetic qualities of the commodity make use of their attractiveness, their aura, their atmosphere. These images serve to stage, costume, and intensify life. And a new resulting aesthetics is concerned with the relation between environmental qualities and human states. This in-between, is atmosphere. Now, I think in these CGIs, not only are we shown a desirable, luxurious urban life, we're also invited to feel it as the light glows and scintillates and beams and flows around these lovely new buildings. And this envelopment in a certain kind of atmosphere is visualised in these highly crafted and polished CGIs, and as marketing devices, of course, it's intended that that glamour should reach out and seduce us, and I'll come back a bit later on to the question of whether that seduction actually works. But for now, more generally, I want to suggest that this notion of atmosphere is a powerful way of understanding the effects of the ubiquity of digital images. The pervasiveness of interactions with social media in so many places, exemplified by the ubiquity of shared images and the way that smartphone screens and their social media apps are the constant companions of so many people now, suggests to many scholars that we should be considering their effects as atmospheric in some way too. They're designed to make us feel that they are trustworthy, seductive, and effortless. And Alison Hearn and Sarah Bannett-Weiser have recently argued, for example, that glamour is actually central to an awful lot of social media activity, particularly in the realm of selfies and influencers and so on. Now, I'm not necessarily meaning that it's just glamorous CGIs of urban spaces that circulate on social media to create atmospheres, although there are plenty of those. But rather, what I'm interested in is how that there's a kind of mode of inhabiting urban space here which is emerging, where that space, that inhabitation, is mediated by what's on screens, but also how we interact with them as part of an everyday urban living through multiple distributed observation events, to quote Mackenzie and Winster again. And Paul Frosch has described what he calls the everyday, routine, embodied cohabitation with digital media as a consequence of the ubiquity of digital images in the urban everyday, not only in terms of how many of them we see, but also how we see them. And this is his description of that cohabitation, which is not the intensity of spectatorship, nor the instrumentality of observation, but rather a sociable relationship of companionship. something much more ordinary, I suppose, and was kind of not noticeable, of being with. This adjacency of mediated images, entities to our lives, is a kind of peripheral and background intuition, an embodied registration of ambient cohabitation, rather than epiphany or passionate engagement. Now, ambient cohabitation with digital media as an ongoing background feeling is understood as generating something that I'm calling atmosphere, and many urban scholars would describe as affective. Frosch describes it as a perpetually circulating social and existential energy. And I propose that this saturates and shapes much of everyday urban experience. So atmosphere then is both about particular kinds of images, but also about that ongoing circulating processual atmosphere. And glamour is just one kind of atmosphere. I'll come back to that. But clearly there are other kinds. For example, I think there's some really interesting work being done by Nana Verhoef and Clancy Wilmot on Google Maps and the notion of navigation as another kind of atmosphere. And I've certainly written recently on the importance of many smart city urban apps that constantly seem to assume that we want to be mobile through cities. We want to do that in the most efficient, fast way possible. So there's a real atmosphere of mobility also going on in much of this mediation. Okay, so far I've suggested that images as data have to be understood as continually processed, as platformed, as ubiquitous. And all that means that they're very often less about representation and more about feeling, less about pictures and more about atmosphere. They're about what being in a city feels like, I think. Now, this atmosphere is multisensory, often, but I'm interested this evening really on what its visuality is specifically. What do cities look like now if they don't look like pictures as we're used to thinking of them? If instead we cohabit with visual companions, you know, what does that distributed kind of looking look like? So I want to move on now to think a bit more about the visual mediation of urban spaces through digital technologies, and I want then to move towards this notion of that it's a form of animation. And I'm going to do that by looking at some digital images of some cities and their neighbourhoods in a quite different way. And I'm going to do it through a visualisation made using a software called ImagePlot. So ImagePlot is a software designed by Lev Manovich's studio. It's open access, you can download it. If I can use it, you can use it. It's freely available. And what it does is analyze an image file's data, and it then allows you to visualize thousands of, literally thousands and thousands of images according to different components of that data. So image plots, in effect, are data visualizations. They analyze an image as a digital object and then position it in a visualization according to some aspect of that digital content. And in that sense, I was struggling with how to phrase this, but in that sense, they don't really work with what we would think of as the visible part of an image. They work with the data, the code that constitutes eventually the image when it appears on a screen after loads of mediations. So in effect, that spreadsheet that you can see there are images. That's what images are. That's one way in which they look now. Now this slide shows a bundle of image plots of cities, I would say, images of cities taken from social media platforms. So image plot, you scrape your images off of Instagram or Twitter, wherever you can, by scraping using relevant hashtags, and image plot then arranges them for you in these kind of color wheels. So the different colors go around the wheel, and the colors are more intense in the middle and less intense on the outside. And image plots then work very directly with the digitality of images, and they directly address, for example, their ubiquity, because as I've said, they can analyze literally thousands and thousands of images. So on the top left, each of those color thumbprints of the different cities, each of those contain 50,000 Instagram images. So we've got that sense of kind of scale there. But also, I want to suggest that image plots can gesture towards how we see all those images, to the visual dynamics of that atmospheric cohabitation. And I'm not suggesting this is the kind of answer to how do we see cities now digitally, but I think it's an interesting tool to play with. And I'm glad to see there's somebody in the audience who's also been working with this kind of, playing with this kind of tool to see what it can do. what it can see. So image plots evoke the scale of digital images. They also evoke how most social media images are just glanced at on a screen or in an app feed. You know, we don't pay them detailed attention, right? I think Paul Frosch is absolutely right there. You know, we scroll, we screen, and occasionally we might pause on one to like or to share. And several authors have suggested in that case it makes little sense to explore individual social media images with that kind of focused attention. Not only because of their numbers, but also because, as I say, we look at them pretty casually and inattentively. So perhaps they are better approached en masse through this kind of visualization as an ensemble or an ecology, a territory or a sequence. And this is the kind of terminology that authors like Adrian Mackenzie, Anna Munster, Sunil Mangani, Daniel Rubenstein and Katrina Sluis have all been working with. So these image plots show ensembles of images. They're the kind of atmosphere that we cohabit. And the default settings of image plot focus on the colours of the image file, rather than what the image might mean or signify or represent. And I've already touched on the importance of colour to digital images, particularly ones that are they're designed on screen, but also when they're pictured on screen. Colour and light are absolutely critical to professionally produce digital images, to architect CGIs, to computer games, to movie visual effects. But also, they're generated en masse by much more ordinary, everyday kind of crappy sorts of images that we scroll through probably without giving them much attention. And the image plot on the right hand there suggests that smart city tweets suggest that smart is a blue and orange phenomenon in cities. And what you can also do with an image plot is zoom. So you can zoom in and out of the image that it creates to look at both the ensemble at the scale, but also to look at its individual components if you want to. And you can identify different kind of areas, different colours, different territories within the ensemble. So the bottom left is a zoom, kind of paused halfway in, if you like, of a grey bit of an image plot, which shows that the grey is being generated in this particular case study by a cycling infrastructure in a North London neighbourhood. And the film critic Thomas Alsacer has suggests that zoom is part of what he identifies as the default value of digital vision. In digital vision, he says, he's talking about cinema in particular, but I think the point holds more broadly. The spectator is no longer a single point of view framed by perspectival techniques. Instead, the spectator is a constantly mobile point of view, decentered, hovering through an environment that seems to have no frame. And this sort of completely unanchored viewing is pervasive in Hollywood superhero movies, and it's also very common in images of cities, drone footage, 3D modelling software that's frequently used now by estate agents and planners in urban promotional videos, and so on. And a completely different example struck me watching the Euro football matches. I'm not a big football fan, I don't watch it very often. I went on to see the final. Drones, multiple cameras, this constant mobile flowing through the football match. Last time I watched football, there was a camera stuck on the stand and you just kind of looked at that view. Right? So we've got this incredibly mobile kind of sense of looking now. And I think this sense of mobility is also partly to do with the kind of endlessness of the ubiquity of digital imagery as well. We're kind of mobile spatially, but also there's no real end to what we might want to look at. And Scott Rodgers has been working with colleagues on how Facebook and Twitter are used to mediate feelings of local community in a neighbourhood in North London, and has tried to visualise the way in which, of course, social media always being updated. There's always something new to check in and to see and to comment, and this is his effort to visualise the comments on that one particular image has generated on Facebook over a period of time. And I think this links to another aspect of very many digital images, which is that as data, they are designed to link to other data. They're designed to be commented on, to be shared, to have hotspots, to have links, and in the case of this still from a video, to have text overlaid so that the image becomes amplified and deepened by other things being laid onto it, connected with it. Now that was a little bit of a list. And in future work, what I'd like to be is much more attentive to the specifics of different examples of different kind of combinations of these different things. But I do think that the notion of animation is a really productive one that speaks to many of these aspects of the cohabitation with ubiquitous imagery. Because what all of these different elements accumulate to, I think, is a sense of an ongoing, live, processual reconfiguration of urban spaces, which owes rather little to the notion of a representational trace. And this is why I'm interested in the notion of animation, and in particular, Deborah Levitt's account of animation. In fact, my PowerPoint is quite remiss here. I should have had lots of moving images, I guess, to show you as well. Animation is a visual genre, of course, but it's about bringing things to life. And for Levitt, that creation of life, that sense of harvesting and sculpting something rather than representing it, is extensive and suggests that animation is the dominant medium of our time, moving us from questions of ontology and category to ones of appearance, metamorphosis, and effect. It's not about models and copies, but rather new territories that can be created. And this speaks to the final item on my list of the various aspects of the digital visual mediation of city spaces, which is their malleability. Although very often images of cities still use the templates of the kinds of photography and cartography and film that have dominated Western visual culture for the past 150 years, these once quite separate visual genres and media are now often bundled up in the same, I've got a visual package, but perhaps in the same digital animation. And this is exemplified in videos like this one that evoke the smart city, which is the city that depends on digital data, that seamlessly mutate between multiple types of visualizations of city spaces, between maps and satellite views and kind of X-rays and flows glowing through the city space, between photographs and computer-generated images. Cities are thus constantly reconfigured in this kind of visualization, in what Levitt calls the mixed space effect of animation. And I think for geographers that's really interesting, the sense that we can have this kind of multiple spatialities constantly flowing and merging into one another, rather than this framed, hard sort of image of urban space. So I want to draw to a close now then, in thinking a little bit more about that notion of mixed space. So I think what's really crucial in trying to think through the implications of a digital visual urban culture is that although it might be very productive to employ a language of atmosphere, of envelopment, of processual animation, perhaps to emphasize that ubiquity, the notion of everyday cohabitation and so on, that does not mean that we don't also need to develop a critical language to think about how social difference, and in particular how socially embodied difference, continues to be inscribed in these animated digital atmospheres. Ubiquity does not imply uniformity or universality. I think that's absolutely, and we need to really center that in theorizing this shift. And I want to make 2 points here, as I say, to bring the lecture to an end. The first is about the multiplicity of atmospheres, and the second is about the recalcitrant materiality of human bodies. So, firstly, I think we need to think about animated atmospheres as multiple. There are lots of different kinds of atmospheres. They can be carefully staged and curated, as in the case of place marketing or computer games or those computer-generated images. I've already suggested that Monica and I described those Doha images, the CGIs, as glamorous. But here's another urban atmosphere generated by another effort at kind of place marketing and regeneration. These are images scraped from Instagram that were posted from the Smithfield redevelopment project in London, thanks to Monica and Isabel Ward's research for this image. And what you can see here, I think, is a quite different kind of visual feel, atmosphere. It's sharp, it's in focus, the colours are much stronger. There's a real emphasis on kind of striking detail. And in particular, there's a lot of emphasis on things that kind of interrupt the routine and the everyday. And we describe, therefore, this atmosphere, which is attempted to be curated by the redevelopment agency, but is also kind of taken off in life of its own as people coming to these events then also post on Instagram their own versions of what they see and what they want to share. We describe this atmosphere as a dramatic atmosphere. And I've also mentioned about a kind of atmosphere of mobility, for example. So there are multiple atmospheres in urban spaces. Atmospheres can be less visual. They can saturate, as I say, for example, bodily mobility. And in a really recent paper by Daniel Paiva and Inigo Sanchez-Fuarez, there's a really interesting idea that they propose, which is the idea of collateral atmospheres. And their particular example, again, it takes off from an effort to curate a particular kind of urban feeling. In this case, Lisbon, the tourist board, setting up all kinds of exciting events and experiences for people visiting Lisbon. Collateral atmosphere are all the really pissed off residents who have to listen to all these bloody events going on, endlessly until midnight, when actually what they're trying to do is get some sleep and, feed the kids and so on. So they're suggesting that there's this kind of, touristified, dynamic, dramatic, perhaps, atmosphere going on in one place that's generating these kind of counter atmospheres around it for other people. And I think that's a very productive sense that an atmosphere itself may kind of generate its own kind of contradictions and pushbacks. So I think we need to bed that sense that atmospheres are multiple into our understanding of these visual atmospheres, and not assume that simply because a powerful regeneration agency or whatever is creating it, it's necessarily going to grip. Secondly, I also think it's absolutely critical not to forget in all this talk of digital animation and urban atmospheres that it's not only cities and technologies that are caught up in this, it's also bodies. It's us, our corporealities. Nick Strinchek describes smartphones as functional and sensorial prostheses. And I think that cuts both ways. A lot of very brilliant and fascinating kind of post-human theory talks about the ways in which bodies are mediated by the smartphone. But also, of course, bodies do things themselves with smartphones. Bodies feel atmospheres through screens, that sensory play of glamorous light or navigation, for example, of drama, or indeed just a very bored scrolling through what Hito Style calls the wretched of the screen, all those naff GIFs and not funny TikToks and pretentious Insta posts. But bodies can push back as they swipe and scroll and labour with digital images. And I've got just one example here, and I could have chosen so many others. Now, I'm not suggesting, absolutely not, that bodies are some kind of ground zero, a real, that can resist the digital. I'm not saying that. In fact, just the contrary. I think it's precisely because bodies are the site of long, highly contested histories of both the representation and effect, as has been made abundantly clear by decades of feminist, critical race, queer, trans, and crip work, that embodiment can be a really rich, contradictory and complex source of experiences and address that can push back against one atmosphere by drawing on other kinds of atmospheres, other kinds of representations, other kinds of experiences. And these debates are very much alive in what I might want to call popular culture now. That sounds a very kind of 1980s term. They can offer resources for different relations with digital images. I think Iona Datta's work with young women and WhatsApp in Delhi is exemplary here. Some of you will know that. Datta emphasises the ongoing journeys and communications, connections, associations, and interceptions made with WhatsApp by these women, and suggests that there are the complex negotiations over their class and gendered identities and mobilities in urban space, which are constantly enacted and reenacted with and through WhatsApp. And this possibility of renegotiating, I think, is really alive right now, quite aggressively so, we might say, particularly on social media. And this is the final reason I like Levitt on animation. She understands animation as a kind of possibility for seeing new kinds of life. New forms of life and vitality emerge at the spectator-screen intersection as this transforms over time, she says. Now, it's beyond this lecture, really, to even gesture towards what those new forms of life might look like. They certainly won't be beach body ready, I hope. But nonetheless, I hope I have managed to say something, at least, about the new forms of visuality through which those new forms of life may become visible. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gillian. That was really fascinating, and my head is full of thoughts and hands are already going up. We're going to try and do a hybrid Q&A now. So those in the room may raise their hands, and those on Zoom can use the Q&A tab, and Marissa here is going to be your ventriloquist, as it were. I think both for the room, yes, perfect. I'm just going to use my chair's profile, I might, to just pick up a little on that idea of pushing back. And you talked about bodies pushing back in a sense, but I was thinking of all kinds of other pushback. And maybe I wasn't the only one in the room who was listening to this kind of sense of a rapid technological change without some kind of sense that there's resistance on many sides. I think both are kind of a returned call to the real. I'm thinking of all the effort to think about fake news and what's kind of real behind that. I was interviewed today by a journalist wondering what it's like for a child to grow up in virtual reality. And I can imagine many people would think, oh no, we need to kind of pull back somehow. And I was also thinking about the calls to open up that black box that is, that you said was kind of opaque and hidden. China just passed the law this week to say algorithms must all be, they must publish their, the algorithms. It must be transparent rather than opaque. So I think, you know, from both a kind of visceral, if you like, a sort of Luddite sense of I don't want my child growing up in virtual reality, but also a politicized sense that, you know, who is in charge of this kind of rush towards a techno future of some kind. So I'd just like to kind of hear you continue your thoughts on, has that pushback got any, does it have any power? Is it significant?
I'm not sure I can answer those last two
Okay,
questions.
sorry.
But certainly, I mean, in terms of a call to the real, I didn't want to suggest that animation is somehow entirely replacing a politics of representation. And I mean, a lot of this work is just so fascinating and rich and creative, and I guess there is a temptation to get a bit carried away with it, which maybe I fell into in the lecture. But I certainly think that the politics of representation remains a really important tool, for sure, because it does suggest, you know, even if there isn't a real that we can access in any kind of absolute, you know, pure and unmediated way, nonetheless there are different degrees of mediation, I suppose, or different degrees of fakeness. And that, and you know, in deep fakes, maybe that's the question on the floor. I don't really know what to think of them, actually, you know, in terms of this kind of haunting of all of this by a continued sense that there is some sort of real that we should not let go of. So I take that point, absolutely. And I think there are, you know, this is a complex moment. It's kind of happened very fast, but I suspect we're probably only at the beginning still. So I think there's a lot of sort of thinking and campaigning and to do, you know, as this emerges further. In terms of opening up the black box, I think that's really an interesting one. A lot of geographers certainly have been arguing similar things. They have also been particularly interested in the kinds of digital labour, manual labour that goes on to make platforms work, right? I mean, it doesn't all happen by magic. It happens with people doing an awful lot of, you know, grunt, poorly paid work in you know, often in other you know, global divisions of labour. I think I have a slight concern about the idea that though all we need to do is kind of make things visible, and that is therefore also to make things accountable. Right. I think that I always prefer things to be complex and messy, but I think that kind of binary of sort of invisibility bad, visibility good is quite problematic. And that's certainly something that I've been learning, reading over the summer actually, the work of Simone Brown and Brandy Summers, who both talk very focused on the racialization of the visual and how that black bodies are not constituted simply as either, you know, invisible or visible, but they're both in different situations. And then the visual field can be kind of folded or you know, it's much more complex than just the sort of visible, invisible kind of binary that I think a lot of critical work tends to work with.
Right.
So I mean, let's open up the black box for sure, but I don't think that will be sufficient to address some of the questions.
And let's not invite surveillance capitalism as a result.
Yes, super surveillance, yeah.
Yes, brilliant. I will open it up now. I can see one person here. The microphone is going to travel, so please.
Just tests are working, yeah. I'm sorry to throw a rain on your parade, but I see these digital cities as digital dystopia, and I also see them as cyber slaves. We've seen Blair's ID card that was stopped, and now we have these disgusting vaccine passports where the state can digitally exclude people because they're not doing what the biomedical dictatorship is telling us what to do. And this is only allowed and only happen in a digital state. And I think it's a horrific thing. I think I like things like electric cars and technology that cleans the environment. I'm all for that. I'm not a Luddite. But there's things here that come in digital cities we've got to be very careful of, because around the world these things, the pandemic has unleashed horrible forces, not just digital capitalism, snooping on what we buy, but there's a lot of, I don't want the big state telling me what to do. I want to spend things in a shop. I don't want to use cash. I don't want the shop owner knowing who I am. I want to be anonymous. You can't be anonymous in a digital state. You're watched by cameras all the time. And I just want your comments on that, because this is the ugly elephant in the room that they don't want to talk about.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
glad
you for
glad
that.
I'm not answering the questions.
I guess one reason I didn't address it very directly was because actually I think my sense is that one of the effects of the pandemic actually is that those kind of issues that you've raised are actually much more in the public domain now than they were even 18 months ago, actually. And I think they're getting a lot of attention, so I guess I wanted to look somewhere else and say some different things. But I'm not sure I would share entirely your phrasing, but certainly the questions of the privacy of data and so on, I mean, they're massive. And they have actually been debated, the NHS track and trace app. You know, that was the first time I'd ever seen a debate about kind of what happens to your online data happening in the UK. I think in other places there have been livelier, more ongoing debates. So I think you're right to raise that question, and hopefully now that we've been through this and we can see more clearly what's happening, that those kind of debates will become more pressing and more persistent.
Brilliant. I'm sorry, I'm going to take a question over here if I can, and then I'm going to come, Marissa, to Q&A on Zoom, just to be sure, but thank you.
Hello, thank you. I hope you can hear through my mask. Thank you so much for that brilliant talk. It was really inspiring, and I'm going to shine on your parade. I wanted to know if you're going to expand a bit on the idea of these recalcitrant bodies, especially in terms of the sensorium. So you gave that example of, you know, graffiti, or a kind of digital graffiti done to the Are You Beach body ready yet? But I'm thinking of kind of softer forms of recalcitrancy. Say things like choosing to wander instead of following your Google map. Choosing to eat somewhere you haven't seen pictures of on Instagram. That sort of softly active going against the new standard versions of experiencing the city through your sensorium.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I have been thinking whether that one element of that is actually again an effect of the pandemic. In fact, this is very speculative, but I think precisely because we have been made to go online, or many of us have chosen to go online more, you know, really intensively over the last 18 years through lockdown, to keep in touch, to entertain ourselves. I also wonder whether that might be not only making us more aware of some of the many aspects of that, not simply leisure, but data surveillance and so on, but also whether it's making us think more about what it means not to engage with the digital. and to do those, as you say, those kind of serendipitous urban encounters, and especially in cities, there are all those long, long traditions of urban theory, which would also argue that the very essence of the city is not actually this kind of very planned and managed, and I'm only going to go somewhere if an influencer has told me it looks great. Actually, it's about the chance encounter, and also often uncomfortable and difficult encounters, and that's the kind of the value of cities. It's not this kind of sanitized, glossy, glamorous experience for sure. And there are certainly some people doing work on digital detox as a kind of practice as well. So I think what you're raising is a really interesting set of issues. What strikes me though is how we would begin to research that systematically. And I think that's a kind of interesting challenge, because you could imagine, if this is a kind of, as I say, sort of urban experience, would you just try and kind of go along with people and kind of check out what they're doing? How would you generate sort of robust research evidence that might allow us to say something more, perhaps more consistent or robust around that? I mean, maybe there are people in the room beginning to think about those sorts of research projects, but I think there are some really interesting questions about research methods actually embedded in some of these changes that we also need to be considering as academics.
Thank you. Marissa, is the audience lively online? Shall we turn to them?
Yes, so we have 6 online questions so far. One from Sarah Curtis is, can these digital representations help us address differently and more effectively issues of social and economic inequality in urban populations and urban life? And Serhad has said, I wonder your thoughts about how women interact with urban spaces with the digital and everyday scale.
I guess I can't have a one-word answer, can I? No. I mean, that's, again, massively necessary question, and one that's incredibly difficult to respond. I know maybe Sonia would like to respond as well. I mean, I think the technology, at some level, is just a tool. And it can do pretty much anything that we want. So I'm looking at you, Marisa, you're personifying the Zoom face. The technology can do whatever we want to do, right? We just have, whoever's designing it, funding it, trialing it, has to have the will to want to solve particular sorts of inequalities, and also, I think, to identify what sorts of inequalities are best resolved by particular kinds of tech. And I think there is a whole kind of tech innovation sort of startup world of kind of bright young men very often kind of inventing tech and then looking for a problem to solve with it. And I absolutely think we need to flip that around and think much more about what kind of social differences, inequalities, injustices can be effectively resolved by online tech. And certainly there are lots of apps for women to other groups who may feel vulnerable to violence in city streets to kind of record their feelings about what a particular place is like, in order to warn others at a particular moment. So the potential is there for sure. It could be extraordinary. I did a bit of outreach work with a group of sixth formers, asking them what they thought driverless cars could be for. And funnily enough, none of them mentioned getting office workers from the station to their office most efficiently. They were all about, well, it could help my mum, travel with her shopping better, or So I think that there's a lot of incredible creativity and potential, but it needs to be institutionalized, I suppose, in a very different way from what we've got now, which is basically about profit, isn't it? And I guess you're finding that in the work that you're doing with children's online experiences.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the desire to kind of rein in or manage big tech is well, it's having its moment now, which is interesting. I would love to develop it, but I can see somebody here in the front who had a question that I think animated by the last one. I'm going to start using that word now.
I just want to say I'm a big fan of your work, so I'm really glad to see you today. Huge fan of Visual Methodologies. It's a huge contribution, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
I want to build up the question on women in digital spaces. So I'm wondering how you would apply a feminist geography lens to understand how gender harassment has followed women into digital spaces and continues to limit their participation in the visual cultures of urban landscapes. I am concerned because the particular features of digital images, such as their perpetual and dynamic nature have been manipulated by perpetrators to develop new or intensified forms of harassment?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, great question. And I can't give you a very informed or considered response, I'm afraid, right now. But it's something that clearly visual images, potentially particularly vulnerable to. And there are many aspects to this. So we can think about sexting, for example, the kind of online abuse that feminists receive online. We can think also around much more subtle forms of the policing of gender. So the Bannett-Weiser co-authored paper on glamour talks about the pressure on young women, particularly, to present themselves in particular ways through, the kind of selfie and and it's a real, serious, massive pressure on them, and it's very difficult to kind of resist and challenge. And certainly looking at the kinds of feminist work that my daughter enjoys reading and has certainly radicalised her in some ways. What also strikes me, despite the kind of Me Too, is how incredibly individualised a lot of that self-presentation is, even if these young women and these older women are trying to kind of resist in some ways. There's the kind of social media account that sort of promotes a kind of celebrity. It's an incredibly complex area. There are certainly plenty of feminist media scholars who are working, really doing fantastic work on that. And I guess it comes back to, it's another aspect of that question about what about embodiment. Gender is clearly being policed, fiercely through this. It's intersectional, of course, as well. So there's much more to be said about that. Thanks for raising it.
Mike, in the back. Thank you.
Thank you for a brilliant lecture. Thank you very much indeed. It was wonderful. I just had a question really about, I love this idea that we need to think about images not as things that are seen, but as things that are felt, or cohabited with, or the sensed even. And that idea that this creating certain sort of aesthetic crises. Now it seems to me that one aspect of this is the question of being lost. Because the story you tell is of images that you don't even know whether they're images anymore. They overwhelm you, they confuse you perhaps, and they make you feel slightly lost in this world of images. And yet, paradoxically, going back to the point that was raised a moment ago, the very technologies that allow you to have those images permanently with us require you always to be geo-tagged, constantly found. So you are simultaneously lost in the world of images, but never lost by the technology that allows those images to circulate around you. So I think there's a really interesting question about what's going on here, about it is a geographical question about the issue of lost and lostness. Anyway, just
That's really evocative, thank you. I guess it's the kind of question that thinking about atmospheres kind of generate, about lostness rather than navigation, which sounds much more pragmatic. No, thank you. So I think the idea of being lost, again, so that's it. I wonder whether that is something that is generational. So I suspect you didn't grow up with social media, as I didn't. And certainly looking, I don't want to, young people, it's clearly massive overgeneralization, but I think, if you have been on, Twitter since you were 13, as some of my, students have, I think that scroll, what seems to us to be overwhelming and a kind of loss and a kind of blur of, it's a different form of wayfinding, perhaps, that's much more, even though it's inattentive, it doesn't necessarily mean it's disoriented. Because nonetheless, somehow there's always that moment where, the scrolling stops and there's a really quick heart, and then it's scrolled on again. So I like the idea of being lost, and the paradox of then also using these to be found is a lovely one, and I think more through that more. I think perhaps something else to layer into this is Clancy Wilmot's work on mobility and mapping. And she went along, she accompanied people as they navigated their way through different cities using Google Maps in particular. But the cities were, I think she describes in the work as post-colonial cities, and one was Sydney, and she did that also with some Aboriginal research participants. And they were layering other kinds of maps onto the Google map. right? Because Google is, it's based on longitude and latitude. It's a Western invention. Google, we kind of take it for granted, but it's clearly a very particular geometry through which it organises space. And her informants were also remembering other histories and other geographies as they were moving through this kind of Google. So I think actually that this notion of kind of mapping and navigation and kind of territories and ensemble, this is actually a very spatial vocabulary that we're moving, perhaps more than a visual one actually in some ways, that we might be moving towards. And maybe that's something to work through in more detail as well. Thanks.
You asked me about my own research on children, and your comment made me think one of the things that people worry about as young people don't get lost in the social world is that they're no longer free to get lost in the physical world, that they are always, either they're not free to move in the physical world or they are tracked and monitored and surveilled. So there are different, maybe they're not lost anywhere, but maybe we'd like them to get a bit more lost. Anyway, I'm going to turn to the Zoom Q&A, and then, yes, I'll come to you after. But thank you. Marissa.
We have another 9 questions, but I'll just read one.
Okay.
One that's been upvoted the most from Andre just says, thanks for the excellent talk. What would be the role of more classical methodologies such as semiology and iconography to understand the circulation of images nowadays?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, great question.
You have a chapter on that, probably.
I was going to say, yes. See the new edition of Visual Methods coming out in a bookshop near you soon. Well, in the same sense that a politics of representation is still alive and kicking, I think those tools of discourse analysis and semiology are really well suited, I think, to thinking through the meanings of an image. They don't work at scale, I think. Or at least not at the kind of scale and ubiquity and that kind of qualitative shift that scale is generating, I think. But that might not necessarily matter all the time. And certainly many digital images, of course, there are particular types of digital images which are not those intended for circulation on social media platforms. You can think of digital artworks, for example. I mean, they are designed precisely to be thought through, carefully in detail with the kind of meanings unpacked. So semiology, discourse analysis would remain incredibly useful there. And of course, a lot of papers I'm reading on social media do a kind of mix. They'll do a kind of quantitative or some kind of visualization, large-scale analysis, and then they will sample somehow, often guided by the results of that larger analysis. They'll pull out a smaller number of images with which to work in more detail, and sometimes those kind of interpretive, meaning-seeking methods are really useful. So, as I say, I'm not saying it's kind of baby in bathwater situation. I think many of our traditional tools of visual analysis remain valuable. But I do think it would be worthwhile experimenting with some different kinds of methods as well. And also some different kind of expectations about what those methods might reveal. So when the paper I published looking at those smart city tweets, and I said, smart is blue and orange. And I got a very grumpy reviewer saying, well, this is pointed. And what does blue and orange mean? What's the cultural significance of blue and orange? And with your valid questions, but I kind of want to say, maybe those kind of questions are not really the thing anymore. Maybe we're feeling blue and orange, and we should be running with that as a kind of finding with its own sort of validity. So, as I say, I'm not particularly proposing image plot as the kind of solution, but I do think we could do with, as I say, a lot more experimentation, I think, with perhaps some quite new forms of methods that may, I suspect, involve tooling up probably with some digital kind of savviness as well. So Richard Rodgers runs a summer school every summer at the University of Amsterdam. And I know he's done a lot of work on images, working with software to kind of gather and collate images in particular ways and then analyse their digital aspects. So there's definitely work emerging around that.
Brilliant. There was a question at the back.
The word you actually used was decentered, which in a way is the same as lost, but slightly different, I think. And I was intrigued because, of course, that's what Virginia Woolf used in her essay Street Haunting. And at many moments in your talk, I was taken back to Baudelaire's description of Paris. So we have had this sense of this losing ourselves, this dissolution of the self, created by experience of the city. You also said at one point in answering these questions that technology does what we want it. Well, yes, as we well know, with the internet and so on, it also does things we don't want. But what is particularly worrying, perhaps, in relation to digital cities is AI, isn't it? Because scientists are incredibly excited by the fact that, of course, it can do just what the human mind cannot do, and can exponentially carry out tests and trials at a speed and at a height of that is beyond imagination until recently. And so I think that is that possibility of the problems created by AI that might come into the, obviously, social media as well, that could create a very different scene to what we've been experiencing so far.
Yes, so thank you for that. I mean, that gives me an opportunity to reiterate that in my incredibly overgeneralized account of 19th century visuality of cities, clearly, there are many other traditions, let's say, or aesthetics, or particularly, I guess, kind of modernist experimentation, which would, of course, we're doing rather different things. So the reference to Woolf is well taken. I think that sense that there was a certain sort of moment of 19th century crisis, and then maybe we're in another moment now. That's kind of intriguing, because I guess at both points there are a lot of different technologies, both kind of emerging, spreading, being used, so then again, I apologise for this if there are any historians in the room, but we could think about the late 19th century. They were kind of telegraph, railroad. Stephen Kearns written about the fears about human bodies couldn't travel at more than the pace of a horse. Right, we'd kind of disintegrate if we went too fast on the train. All those stories about people sitting in the cinema for the first time and seeing the film of a train coming out and running out. I think some of these actually are rather apocryphal, but so I think that sense of crisis is perhaps. And again, we're at the early stages. Smartphones have only been around for just over a decade. We're at the early stage of a really comprehensive, I think, probably technological shift. And so I suppose that sense of crisis is not necessarily unexpected. It probably manifests in slightly different ways, depending on the technologies. But AI in particular is a huge area, isn't it? And I think this is where that notion of making the black box of AI kind of visible and accountable, I think, particularly falls down, because as I understand the way AI works, and I'm indebted to the work of Louise Moore in particular here, although machine learning algorithms, particularly ones that recognize images and label images, learn from the way that the images have themselves been labeled by human viewers. What then starts to happen with machine learning is that it's kind of generative. And actually, it's very difficult, I think, for human operators to understand exactly why a particular AI process ends up where it does. So it makes that notion of, well, let's just, share the AI code, if there even is such a thing, to sort of make it accountable and visible, really quite problematic. I think AI, it doesn't do what we want it to do. It doesn't even do things in the way that we think of as kind of interpretive or causal or at all. So that's a real issue here. And I think this is why I certainly need to do some more deep, find some particular case studies that would really explore a particular example of that in quite specific ways. Thanks.
I fear that we have come to the end of our time. I believe that for those who are here in person, there is even a drinks reception outside, which is one of the benefits of being embodied and present. So I want to say thank you so much, Gillian, for a really fascinating lecture. And thank you to the audience here and also on Zoom for your questions. The British Academy lectures will, it says here, hopefully return to their usual schedule and frequency in 2022 with 10 to 12 lectures each year. So please keep an eye on the website and social media channels. As I said, there is a drinks reception outside. Can I just thank Gillian once more very much indeed.
Thank you for your questions.